5 terrifying Wendigo encounters in frozen winter forests. These terrifying tales are based on true accounts shared by those who claim to have come face to face with the Wendigo, a creature from Native American folklore said to haunt the frozen wilderness. Known for its insatiable hunger and chilling presence, the Wendigo is a legend, but these encounters might make you question whether it's more than just a story. Here are their stories. My name is Matt Larson, and this happened 2 winters ago near the Boundary Waters in northern Minnesota. I'd taken a trip to go ice fishing, something I'd done countless times before. The lake I picked was remote, surrounded by dense forest, which was perfect for the solitude I was craving. I didn't know that this trip would leave me questioning everything I thought I knew about the wilderness. I set up my fishing shack early in the morning, drilling a hole through the thick ice and settling in with my gear. The first few hours were uneventful, just the quiet serenity of the frozen lake and the occasional bite on my line. By noon, I decided to stretch my legs and take a short walk into the woods that bordered the lake. The snow in the forest was pristine, untouched except for a few scattered animal tracks. It was peaceful, almost eerily so, with the muffled silence that only deep snow can create. As I wandered, I noticed a set of footprints cutting through the snow. At first, I thought they might belong to another hiker, but something about them wasn't right. They were massive, long, narrow footprints with claw-like impressions at the toes. They almost looked human but distorted, unnatural. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to follow them. The tracks led deeper into the woods, weaving through the trees in an erratic pattern. The further I went, the quieter the forest became. Even the wind seemed to have stopped, leaving an oppressive stillness in its place. That's when I heard it, a low growl, deep and guttural, coming from somewhere ahead. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. The sound wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard. It was almost deliberate, as though it wanted me to hear it. My first instinct was to turn back, but I was rooted in place, straining to see through the trees. Then I saw it. A shadow moved between the trees, tall and impossibly thin. It was too far away to make out details, but its sheer height was unnerving. It had to be at least 7 or 8 feet tall. Its limbs were long and gangly, hanging in a way that seemed unnatural, almost spider-like. I felt my chest tighten as the shadow disappeared behind a tree, only to reappear closer a moment later. It wasn't walking so much as gliding, its movements unnervingly smooth. My breath came in short, panicked gasps, and I realized I needed to get back to the shack. I turned and started walking quickly, trying not to make too much noise. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming, like a weight pressing down on my shoulders. The growling came again, this time closer, followed by a series of sharp, snapping sounds, branches breaking under something heavy. I broke into a run, my boots crunching loudly in the snow. The sound of my own footsteps was deafening, but beneath it, I could hear something else. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, matching my pace. When I reached the edge of the lake, I felt a moment of relief, thinking the open space would give me some safety. But as I turned back toward the forest, I saw it again. The figure was standing just inside the tree line, partially obscured by the shadows. It was closer now, and I could see more of its features. Its body was skeletal, with pale, almost translucent skin stretched tightly over its bones. Its head was elongated, with hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light. I stumbled back toward the shack, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. Inside, I grabbed the nearest object, a fishing spear, and sat with my back against the wall, trying to calm my racing heart. For the next few hours, I heard faint scratching noises outside the shack, followed by soft thuds, as though something heavy was circling it. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow pass by the frosted window, but I was too terrified to look directly. As the sun began to set, the noises stopped. I waited until the last light of day to pack up my gear, too afraid to stay another night. When I stepped outside, the first thing I noticed was the tracks. The same massive clawed footprints were all around the shack, overlapping my own from earlier in the day. They led back into the woods, disappearing into the shadows. I don't know what I encountered that day, but I haven't been back to that lake since. Sometimes, I dream about those glowing eyes, staring at me from the edge of the forest, and every time, I wake up with the same thought. Whatever it wasn't human, and it wanted me to know I didn't belong there. Story number 2. My name is Jessica Kane, and this happened last winter while my boyfriend Liam and I were camping in Algonquin Park, Ontario. Winter camping was something we both loved. The solitude, the beauty of the snow-covered forests, and the challenge of braving the cold. But after this trip, Liam and I haven't gone camping since. We arrived at the park on a Friday afternoon, setting up our tent near a frozen lake. The area was remote, surrounded by towering pines, and the silence was almost surreal. We spent the day hiking and collecting firewood, enjoying the crisp winter air and the feeling of being completely alone in the wilderness. That night, we built a fire and sat beneath a clear, star-filled sky. The only sounds were the crackling of the flames and the occasional rustle of the wind in the trees. Then, around 10 p.m., we heard it. It started as a low howl, deep and resonant, echoing through the forest. At first, we thought it might be a wolf or a coyote, but as the sound grew louder, it changed. The howl rose into a high-pitched scream, like something inhuman. Liam froze, his eyes wide. What the hell was that? I shook my head, trying to steady my breathing. I don't know. Maybe an animal? But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I've heard wolves and coyotes before, and this was nothing like that. It sounded wrong, like it didn't belong to any living creature I could imagine. We sat there in silence, straining to hear anything else. For a while, the forest was quiet again, and we tried to convince ourselves it was just the wind. But the unease lingered, and we decided to call it a night. Inside the tent, I couldn't sleep. Every sound outside made my heart race, the faint crack of a branch, the whisper of the wind. Around 2 a.m., I heard something heavy moving through the snow outside. "Liam," I whispered, shaking him awake. "Do you hear that?" He groggily sat up, listening. The sound was unmistakable. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching in the snow, circling our campsite. "It's probably a deer," he muttered, though his voice wavered. But I knew it wasn't. Whatever was out there was too heavy, and its movements were too purposeful. I held my breath as the footsteps came closer, stopping just outside the tent. Then, in the faint light of the moon shining through the fabric, I saw a shadow. It was tall, much taller than a person, and its outline was strange, almost distorted. Its arms hung unnaturally low, and its head was tilted as though it were listening. "Liam," I whispered again, my voice barely audible. "Something's out there." He grabbed the small hatchet we'd brought for chopping firewood and motioned for me to stay quiet. The shadow lingered for a moment before the footsteps started again, moving away from the tent and toward the fire pit. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. My breath caught in my throat. Standing by the fire pit was a figure unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was skeletal, its pale skin stretched tightly over its bones. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the dying embers of the fire, and its mouth hung open, revealing jagged, blackened teeth. It stood there, motionless, its head slowly turning as though it were searching for something. Then it let out a low, guttural growl that sent chills through my entire body. I zipped the tent back up and huddled next to Liam, too terrified to speak. The footsteps resumed, circling the tent again and again, each pass slower than the last, By dawn, the sounds had stopped, but neither of us dared to leave the tent until the sun was fully up. When we finally emerged, the first thing I noticed were the tracks. They were massive, long and narrow, with deep claw marks at the tips. They circled the tent and led off into the forest, disappearing into the trees. The fire pit was untouched, but the air still felt heavy, oppressive, like whatever had been there was still watching us. We packed up in record time, leaving behind anything we couldn't carry. The entire hike back to the car, I felt like we were being followed, though I didn't dare look back. When we reached the safety of the car, I broke down, sobbing into Liam's arms. He tried to comfort me, but I could see the fear in his eyes too. I don't know what we encountered that night. Liam insists it was just a trick of the shadows, but I know what I saw. Whatever it wasn't an animal, and it wasn't human. It was something ancient, something that didn't belong in this world. I haven't gone camping since, and I doubt I ever will again. But sometimes late at night, I still hear that howl echoing in my mind, and I wonder if it's still out there, waiting for its next visitors. Story number 3. My name is Paul Andrews, and I've been hunting in the forests of Wisconsin for over 20 years. I've tracked deer, elk, and bear in some of the most remote areas of the state. I've camped alone for weeks and spent nights in deep, dark woods without a second thought. But after what happened last winter in the Chequamegon National Forest, I don't think I'll ever feel safe in the woods again. It was late December, just after a fresh snowfall. The forest was quiet and still, the kind of perfect hunting conditions I lived for. I'd been tracking a large buck for most of the afternoon, following its trail through the snow. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, I realized I was farther from my truck than I'd planned. I decided to head back, but on the way, I noticed something strange. A second set of tracks crossing the buck's trail. At first, I thought they belonged to another hunter, but as I got closer, I realized they weren't human. The tracks were massive, at least twice the size of my boot, and they were shaped like elongated feet with claw-like marks at the tips. They didn't look like anything I'd ever seen before, and their gait was strange, almost erratic, like whatever made them had an unnatural stride. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to follow the new tracks. They led deeper into the forest, winding between the trees in a way that didn't make sense. The forest grew darker as the last light of day faded, and an uneasy silence settled over the woods. About 15 minutes in, I began to hear something. It started as a faint rustling in the distance, but it quickly grew louder, a steady, deliberate sound of something moving through the snow. I stopped and scanned the forest around me, gripping my rifle tightly. My breath fogged in the cold air, and my heart pounded in my chest. Then I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, a tall, thin figure moving between the trees. It was at least 8 feet tall, its limbs impossibly long and gangly, and it moved with a strange, gliding motion. I froze, unable to take my eyes off it. It stepped into a patch of moonlight, and I got a better look. Its skin was pale and stretched tightly over its skeletal frame, and its eyes glowed faintly yellow in the darkness. Its face was gaunt, with sharp cheekbones and a mouth full of jagged, blackened teeth. I raised my rifle, aiming at the creature, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the barrel steady. Before I could fire, the creature tilted its head, staring at me with an almost curious expression. Then it let out a scream, a piercing, unearthly sound that echoed through the forest, sending chills down my spine. I panicked and ran, my boots crunching loudly in the snow. The scream didn't stop. It followed me, growing louder and more distorted, like it was inside my head. I don't know how I made it back to the truck. The entire way, I felt like something was behind me, its presence pressing down on me, but I was too afraid to look back. When I finally reached the truck, I jumped in, locked the doors, and floored the gas pedal. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away from the forest. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw its face, those glowing eyes and jagged teeth. I kept hearing that scream, echoing in my mind. The next morning, I went online to try and make sense of what I'd seen. That's when I came across stories of the Wendigo, an ancient creature from Native American folklore said to haunt the northern forests. The descriptions matched what I'd seen almost perfectly. I don't know if what I saw was a Wendigo or something else entirely, but I do know one thing. It wasn't natural. It wasn't supposed to exist. I haven't gone hunting alone since that day, and I don't think I ever will again. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just watching me, it was hunting me, and I'll never forget the terror of knowing that I was the prey. Story number 4. My name is Sarah Whitman, and I'll never forget what happened to me in Glacier National Park last winter. I've always loved hiking alone. It's my way of escaping the noise of everyday life and reconnecting with nature. But after that day, I realized there are some things in the wilderness that you're better off not encountering. It was early February, and I had the day off work. The forecast called for light snow, but the skies were clear when I started the trail. I chose a less traveled route, one that wound through dense forest before opening up to a high ridge with breathtaking views of the snow-covered peaks. It was perfect, or so I thought. The first half of the hike was uneventful. The trail was covered in a fresh layer of snow, and I could see animal tracks crisscrossing the path, rabbits, deer, even a few larger paw prints that might have been a wolf. I felt completely alone, but in a good way. The forest was silent, except for the crunch of my boots and the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. About an hour in, the weather started to shift. The clear skies turned grey, and the wind picked up, carrying flurries of snow that stung my face. I debated turning back, but I was close to the ridge and figured I could make it before the storm rolled in. That's when I noticed something strange. Off to the side of the trail, there was a set of tracks unlike any I'd seen before. They were huge, at least twice the size of my boot, and elongated, with long claw marks at the tips. They looked human, but distorted, like something had tried to mimic a person's footprints, but didn't quite get it right. I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a bear, though the shape of the tracks didn't match. Against my better judgment, I stepped off the trail to follow them. The tracks led deeper into the forest, weaving between the trees in a pattern that didn't make sense. It was as if whatever made them was pacing, or maybe circling. The deeper I went, the quieter the forest became. The wind stopped, and even the sound of my own footsteps seemed muffled. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from all around me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard, deep and resonant, almost vibrating in my chest. My first instinct was to turn back, but as I started to retrace my steps, I realized something horrifying. The tracks were gone. The snow where I'd walked was smooth and untouched, as if I'd never been there. Panic set in, and I quickened my pace, trying to find my way back to the trail. But no matter which way I turned, everything looked the same, just endless trees and snow. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A tall, skeletal figure was standing about 50 feet away, partially hidden behind a tree. Its limbs were impossibly long, its pale skin stretched tightly over its bones. Its head was tilted to one side, and its glowing yellow eyes were locked onto me. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The creature didn't move, but I could feel its presence pressing down on me, suffocating and cold. Then it let out a sound, a piercing, high-pitched scream that made my ears ring. I ran. I didn't care about the direction, I just needed to get away. The forest blurred around me, and the sound of the creature's scream seemed to follow, echoing in my head. After what felt like an eternity, I burst out onto the ridge. The storm had cleared slightly, and I could see the trail ahead, leading back down the mountain. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. I turned back to the forest and saw it again. The creature was standing at the tree line, watching me. It didn't follow, but it didn't disappear either. It just stood there, as if it was letting me go. This time. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. When I got in, I locked the doors and sat there for a long time, shaking and gasping for air. I haven't been back to Glacier since, and I don't plan to. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't an animal. It wasn't human. It felt ancient, malevolent, like it had been waiting for me, and I'll never forget the way its eyes bore into mine, as if it could see straight into my soul. Story number 5. My name is Jacob Miller, and this happened last winter at my family's remote cabin in the Maine wilderness. My brother Ethan and I had planned a weekend getaway, just the two of us, some ice fishing, and a break from the stress of city life. The cabin was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dense forest and only accessible by a narrow, snow-covered road. It was the kind of place where you could go days without seeing another person. We arrived on a Friday afternoon and spent the day settling in, chopping firewood and clearing snow off the small lake near the cabin. Everything was quiet, peaceful even. That night, we built a fire in the wood stove, cooked dinner, and sat by the window, looking out at the moonlit forest. It was around 11 p.m. when we first heard it. A low, guttural growl echoed through the trees, followed by a sharp scratching sound along the side of the cabin. "What the hell was that?" Ethan asked, his voice tense. I shrugged, trying to stay calm. "Probably a bear," I said, though I knew it was unlikely. Bears were rare in the area during the winter. They'd be hibernating by now. Ethan grabbed a flashlight, and we stepped outside to investigate. The snow crunched under our boots as we circled the cabin, but we didn't see anything. No tracks, no sign of movement, just the heavy silence of the woods. We went back inside, bolted the door, and tried to shake off the unease. But I couldn't help feeling like we were being watched. Around midnight, the sound started again. This time, it was louder, scratching, followed by heavy, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. "Jake," Ethan whispered, peeking out the window. "I think someone's out there." I joined him and scanned the tree line, but all I could see was darkness. Then, just as I was about to turn away, I saw it. A tall, skeletal figure stood just beyond the trees, its pale, elongated body illuminated by the moonlight. Its limbs were unnaturally long, and its head tilted at an odd angle, as if it was studying us. "Get away from the window," I hissed, pulling Ethan back. My heart was pounding as I grabbed the hunting rifle we'd brought for protection. The footsteps grew louder, circling closer and closer. At one point, it sounded like whatever was outside was right by the front door. Ethan and I huddled in the corner of the cabin, clutching the rifle and a hatchet, too terrified to move. The scratching returned, this time at the windows, accompanied by a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the walls. Hours passed, and the sounds eventually stopped, but neither of us dared to sleep. When the first light of dawn crept through the windows, we cautiously stepped outside. The snow around the cabin was covered in tracks, massive, clawed footprints that circled the building and led off into the woods. The wooden walls of the cabin were scratched deeply, as though something with enormous claws had tried to tear its way inside. We didn't waste any time packing up. Most of our gear was left behind as we loaded into the truck and sped away. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that figure standing at the edge of the forest, watching us leave. When we got back to town, we told a local shopkeeper what had happened. His face turned pale, and he muttered something under his breath. Wendigo. He explained the legend, an ancient creature from Native American folklore, cursed with an insatiable hunger for flesh and a hatred for trespassers. The description sent chills down my spine, matching exactly what we had seen. Ethan and I haven't been back to the cabin since. I don't even like to think about it, but sometimes late at night, I'll hear faint scratching sounds at my window, even though I live miles from the woods. I tell myself it's just the wind, but deep down, I know better. Whatever we encountered that night wasn't just a story, it was real, and it wanted us to know we weren't welcome. Whether it's an ancient curse, a supernatural predator, or something beyond explanation, these stories remind us to tread carefully in the winter wilderness. If you enjoyed these chilling tales, like, subscribe, and share your own eerie experiences in the comments below. Stay safe out there.